Dr. Locke has been missing for 3 weeks now, and the police have been searching for clues everywhere, but with no luck. Little did anyone know, at this very moment, Dr. Locke is sitting leisurely in a commercial building, reading the newspaper. However, he is no longer Dr. Locke, but rather the bookstore owner, William Deller. In fact, even before killing his wife, he had already rented this small shop in the commercial building under the identity of William Deller. The commercial building is like a city within a city. Restaurants, laundry, grocery stores, you name it. So for the past 3 weeks, he has not left this place. Gradually, the people here have also gotten used to his presence. During these 3 weeks, although he has encountered a few acquaintances here, his clever disguise has fooled everyone's eyes. His murdered wife has been buried, and people are no longer paying attention to the case. The newspaper even speculates that Dr. Locke may have also been murdered. Seeing this, he smugly tosses the ridiculous newspaper aside and goes to Miss Mary's store to have some coffee. Miss Mary runs an antique shop on this floor, and she is a beautiful woman. Seeing Dr. Locke's arrival, Miss Mary warmly greets, "Hey, I was just thinking you should come." Dr. Locke responds, "It's the smell of your coffee and you that drew me here." His gaze sweeps across the familiar room and lands on the set of armor and a large Spanish-style chest in the corner, both of which are Miss Mary's favorites. Miss Mary says, "Ah, too bad no one can afford them." Dr. Locke laughs and says, "If I hit it big one day, I'll definitely buy these 2 treasures from you." As Miss Mary brews the coffee, she says, "The reports about that doctor in the newspaper have been dwindling lately. I'm starting to think he's been murdered too." Like everyone else, they often discuss the missing Dr. Locke. At first, Miss Mary believed that Dr. Locke had run off with some pretty woman, killed his wife, and was now having a good time somewhere in the world. But Dr. Locke insists, "Don't be too romantic, my dear. I think the doctor's body is floating somewhere towards the Gulf of Mexico. I heard the police found his scarf on the riverbank." Miss Mary hands him a cup of coffee and says, "Regardless, it seems like the police have stopped searching." Dr. Locke takes a sip and praises, "Your coffee tastes really good. Mary, are you planning to go out this month?" Miss Mary nods, looks at him affectionately, and says, "Right away. I'm going to New York tomorrow, and I also want to attend an exhibition in London, then go to Paris, Rome, Zurich." "William, just the thought of you being here to look after these things, I can leave with peace of mind. I'll leave the shop key with you. How about that?" Dr. Locke nods happily and says, "No problem, until you come back." After that, he gets up and leaves. Dr. Locke hums a tune as he walks towards his bookstore. Suddenly, he notices a person coming out of an office across the bookstore, walking quickly towards him. It's none other than Officer Lawrence, Dr. Locke's brother-in-law. Dr. Locke's initial reaction was to immediately turn around and go back to Miss Mary's antique shop, but ultimately, he decided to confront the person. His disguise had fooled many people, and now he was Mr. William, the bookstore owner. Dr. Locke had already shaved off his little mustache, and his brown contact lenses had changed his blue eyes. After hesitating for a moment, Dr. Locke took out a cigar from his pocket and lit it after several attempts. They were getting closer and closer to each other, staring at each other. Lawrence quickly walked towards the elevator while Dr. Locke hurriedly walked towards the bookstore. He pretended to walk easily, but couldn't help but sneak a glance at the corridor. At that moment, Lawrence also turned his head to look. Dr. Locke struggled to open the door of the bookstore, but just as he was about to close it, he saw a line of words on the opposite office door, Jackson Law Firm, and below that were even more important words, investigation. Dr. Locke didn't sleep well all night, and it wasn't until the next morning that he regained his composure. However, A few hours later, something unexpected happened when he was buying cigarettes in the lobby. A well-dressed woman walked towards the pet grooming shop, holding a dog. Oh my God, wasn't she his old patient, Mrs. Hyde? That's right, and her curly-haired dog too. Dr. Locke's heart almost stopped beating. The curly-haired dog recognized him and happily barked and ran towards Dr. Locke. Dr. Locke instinctively dodged the dog and pretended to pull its ear with a fake voice, saying, "Cute little guy, you must have mistaken me for someone else." Mrs. Hyde apologized and nodded, pulling the dog away. If even Mrs. Hyde and his own brother-in-law couldn't recognize him, then what was there to worry about? But he knew very well that this cat-and-mouse game couldn't continue, and he had to leave the country as soon as possible. A few days later, Jackson Law Firm suddenly visited, which caught Dr. Locke off guard. Mr. Jackson politely said, "My name is Jackson and I live across from you. I have a special interest in rare books. Would you mind if I take a look around?" Dr. Locke stood up in a panic, knocking over the books on the table. He warmly shook Mr. Jackson's hand and said, "Nice to meet you." Mr. Jackson replied, "I just wanted to say hello. I'll come visit you when you're free." He then walked towards the door. It was another false alarm, Dr. Locke thought. If this went on, he wouldn't be able to stay calm and would surely arouse suspicion. Just as he was about to escape, Miss Mary sent a telegram from Paris. "Arrived in Paris. Will call Friday night." Today was Thursday, so Dr. Locke had to wait for her call and couldn't leave immediately. After reading the telegram, Dr. Locke went to Miss Mary's antique shop and looked around. He stopped his gaze at the two antiques as usual. He looked at the huge Spanish box, and a thought flashed through his mind. In an emergency, this would be a good hiding place. In the evening, Dr. Locke was surprised to find his photo in the newspaper again. The same familiar face with a nice little mustache. That's how he looked before the murder. The report claimed that Dr. Locke had been caught by a Seattle cop. Dr. Locke breathed a long sigh of relief, putting all his worries aside. But the good times didn't last long, as the annoying lawyer Jackson showed up again, saying enthusiastically, "I've brought a few friends who would like to meet you." Dr. Locke muttered to himself, "My hunch was right. Damn brother-in-law and lawyer are definitely after me. Bring it on." He knew what to do. Dr. Locke sincerely said, "Can I help you with something?" Lawyer Jackson smiled and said, "This is Lawrence and Officer Rip, my friends from headquarters. I hope this isn't too sudden for you." Dr. Locke forced a smile and said, "Welcome, gentlemen. Please, have a seat." He sat down at the desk and casually addressed an envelope, then stood up and said, "I have an important letter to mail. Be right back." Officer Rip politely said, "Take your time. We'll wait for you." Dr. Locke hurried to Miss Mary's antique shop, finding the corridor empty. He immediately closed the door of the antique shop, relieved, thinking to himself, they would definitely search every room in this building. His gaze once again stopped at the large Spanish-style box, and he told himself, "Hide in there!" The box was open, and Dr. Locke squeezed himself inside. He slowly lowered the heavy lid, leaving only a small gap for air. At that moment, he heard faint footsteps in the corridor, quickly closing the lid. With a click, the box was plunged into total darkness, quiet enough to suffocate. 20 minutes later, Dr. Locke heard Officer Rip's voice. "Where did that guy go?" "We still have 60 tickets to sell for the charity game." Then came the voice of Lawyer Jackson. "Oh, give the tickets to me. I guarantee you'll get the money. Mr. William is a great guy. He'll definitely buy them." Then they left. It turned out the officers were eager to offload charity game tickets and seemed to be trying to sell them to Dr. Locke. Another false alarm. Dr. Locke breathed a sigh of relief only to realize that no matter how hard he tried to open the lid, it was futile. The box was firmly locked. He closed his eyes in despair. The bookstore owner of the business building, William Deller, went missing. This caused quite a stir in the building for a while, but after a few days, no one paid attention to it anymore. A month later, Miss Mary returned from Europe and was pleased to see her antique shop being well taken care of by Mr. William. However, she was a bit disappointed to hear about Mr. William's disappearance. Suddenly, she noticed that the huge Spanish antique box had been accidentally locked by some idiot while closing the lid. So, she took out the key. When Miss Mary lifted the lid, a terrified scream echoed throughout the entire building.